I've been connected with Quakers 40 years or more as a member of several committees, the corporation, the board, Africa panel, and the Friends Relation. I consider it, however, today, one of my highest honors to be in support of Andrew Tomlinson, who has for the past 12 years worked diligently to foster effective, quiet diplomacy in his leadership role as director of the Quaker United Nations Office in New York. Andrew's programmatic focus includes the integration of peace building and prevention perspectives across the UN system, and upholding the role of peaceful, just, and inclusive societies within development frameworks and in crisis response. And Andrew's background holds a master's degree from the University of Cambridge and the University of Pennsylvania, where he specialized in South Asia and the Middle East. Prior to his current work, Andrew was employed in international finance and socially responsible investing positions in London and New York. Once a cathedral choir boy, Andrew is now a member of the Chatham Summit monthly meeting in New Jersey since his coming to Philadelphia. He lives in New York with his wife, Ursula, who is a pediatric nurse practitioner at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, and they have 2 children. I am thrilled to be here with you and Andrew, and we welcome him now for his words.
Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Gretchen, and thank you all for being here. It's just wonderful to see so many faces and to meet new friends. And as you see, the plan today is I'll just give a 15-minute update on what's happening here, and then we'll get to have a chance to get into some of your thoughts and questions. So to begin with, I wanted to give you a sense of what the last few months have been like in New York. QUNO staff, and there's 6 of us, have been working from home since the 2nd week in March. That's 4 months now. One advantage of that is I haven't had to put on a suit and a tie since early March, which is a wonderful thing. But New York has been hard hit by the coronavirus. At the peak in late March and early April, there were almost 1,000 deaths a day in the New York area. That has an extraordinary impact on hospitals, on healthcare workers, and on all responders. And poor communities and communities of color were especially badly affected. I was in New York for the World Trade Center attacks in September 2001, and the human and economic impact of COVID-19 on New York City has been worse than that. In the first few weeks, Midtown was eerily quiet, with very few people on the streets, only an occasional car, and most businesses shut. And then on May 25th, just 6 weeks ago, George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. Democratic protests against racism and police violence quickly sprang up in response. And in New York, as elsewhere, the largely nonviolent protests were often met with aggressive and militarized approaches by the police. In Midtown Manhattan, a few streets away from here, store windows were boarded up for many blocks, and private security guards with dogs were lined up in front of Saks Fifth Avenue as media reports fanned fears of looting and violence. By now, in early June, new infections and deaths are significantly down in New York, although growing rapidly elsewhere in the US, and things are starting to open up, but the economic hit is extreme. With over 40 million people unemployed in this country now, and with the largest impact on the less well-paid, the fragility of the US economic system has become all too clear. And the coronavirus has exposed racial and economic inequalities, with Black and Hispanic communities experiencing 3 times the levels of infections and deaths. So I'm talking to you today from Quaker House, just a few blocks away from the United Nations headquarters itself on the East River. At the UN, as the impact of COVID-19 became clear, major public meetings were quickly postponed or modified. 2020 is the 75th anniversary of the founding of the UN, so there had been many big meetings planned. For example, this year's Commission on the Status of Women, set to be one of the largest gatherings of women activists in many years, had to be cancelled. QUNO's UN counterparts in New York also quickly shifted to working from home. The Executive Office of the Secretary General regained its balance quite quickly, with the Secretary General providing leadership with his ceasefire call as early as March 23rd. But member state bodies took much longer to find their footing. The Security Council, in particular, was sidelined by procedural debates and political sniping. Most notably, the Council took almost 4 months to approve a resolution on COVID-19 and the ceasefire call. The Peacebuilding Commission is now holding meetings virtually, but civil society is largely excluded. And that, unfortunately, is part of a broader pattern of worsening civil society access at the UN and in many other political forums around the world under these new virtual arrangements. And in looking at the global picture, the coronavirus, of course, is still unfolding. Although for some countries now, it feels like it's a thing in the past. For most countries in the world, and of course many parts of the United States, the crisis is just getting going. And the vulnerability of countries with weak healthcare systems, fragile economies, and high population density is obvious. The situations of refugees and migrants, as well as those directly impacted by conflict, injustice, and exclusion, is of great concern. Humanitarian appeals for assistance have been very underfunded, as the largest donor countries focus on domestic concerns, including shoring up their own economies. So maybe I should step back a little. What are Quakers doing at the UN anyway? And why is there a Quaker House? What happens there? Quakers have been at the UN since the very beginning. In the midst of the global crises of 2020, the events of 1945 may seem long ago and far away, yet that year saw the final cataclysmic actions and the most destructive conflict the world has known, including the liberation of the concentration camps in Europe and the atomic bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And on the 26th of June, 1945, almost exactly 75 years ago, world leaders, driven by the urgency of never again, came together in San Francisco to sign the Charter of the United Nations, stating as their purpose to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind. Friends around the world were deeply involved in humanitarian work and advocacy during the war and its immediate aftermath. And then 2 years later, in 1947, Friends were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for those efforts, and the Quaker offices at the United Nations were established in New York and in Geneva. From the beginning, those offices were set up as a partnership between the global community of friends, represented by FWCC, and the adjacent Quaker service agencies, the American Friends Service Committee for QUNO New York, and Quaker Peace and Social Witness for QUNO Geneva. Oversight is provided by the Quaker UN committees in each location, which include representatives from Quakers worldwide. In New York, the QUNO focus in recent years has been on peace building and the prevention of violent conflict, seeking to build constituencies for sustainable and people-centered strategies for peace. Our colleagues in Geneva focus their work on 4 streams: human rights and refugees, peace and disarmament, human impact of climate change, and sustainable and just economic systems. And you'll be hearing later this year from Jonathan Woolley, QUNO's Geneva's director, who'll talk more about the Geneva programs. My focus today is on New York. In recent years, QUNO New York's impact can be seen in examples such as the global commitment to fostering peaceful, just, and inclusive societies that was enshrined within the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which is the framework for the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, including Goal 16, the Peace Goal. Or in the new UN guidelines that encourage UN teams in countries around the world to engage with local communities and their efforts to promote sustaining peace. Or in the growth of new ideas arising from a series of intense discussions with UN counterparts that we are hosting to shape the Secretary General's agenda for preventing violent conflict around the world. But for us as Quakers, how we go about our work is as important as what we do. Quiet diplomacy is at the heart of our work. We bring people together. Quaker House provides a unique setting and a protected space for challenging conversations. Our meetings are often smaller, off the record, and designed to build relationships and trust. We create impartial settings, prioritize the sharing of experience over theory or dogma in order to find ways for messages to be heard. We talk to all stakeholders because time and time again, we have seen connection overcome conflict. And above all, we know how to listen. We listen because we believe strongly that peace is both the means and the end. And the integrity of that is key. How we work has been central to the success of the Quaker Witness at the UN. And through its long-term relationships, QUNO has built up a rich understanding of the structures, of the cultures, and the people that make up the UN environment. And that is why generations of diplomats, UN officials, and civil society representatives have worked with us to prioritize peace and prevent war. So coming back to today then, what of QUNO in the time of pandemic? In the first weeks, QUNO staff reached out to our colleagues and counterparts across the UN system. We did a series of interviews with peace and development advisors all around the world, gauging the impact of the pandemic on the UN's peace work with communities and offering support and encouragement where we could. In early April, QUNO and other QUNO organizations publicly supported the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire. And then later that month, QUNO New York sent out to UN policymakers some initial thinking around people-centered and sustainable approaches to peace, justice, and inclusion in a COVID-19 world. And the centerpiece of that statement was to support calls to choose compassion over violence, to move beyond the ceasefire, to step aside more broadly from the machinery of war, including to call a halt to the use of sanctions that indiscriminately publish entire populations, and to look at freezing military spending to free up critical resources to save lives and support the most vulnerable. And over the last few weeks, we've worked closely with our colleagues in Geneva to follow the urgent debate on systemic racism and police brutality in the Human Rights Council, which took place 2 weeks ago on the initiative of African governments. And with direct feedback from QUNO Geneva, we were able to coordinate with FWCC in the United States as they sought to work with human rights partners here. Looking forward, in many ways, the current crisis, horrendous as it is, feels like a dress rehearsal for the global social and economic disruption that will likely arise as a consequence of climate change and environmental degradation. What is becoming clear is how poorly prepared our political and economic systems are for such extreme shocks, and how the mechanisms for addressing differences and grievances in our own societies and internationally are woefully underdeveloped. It has become even clearer than ever before how much we need global solutions to global problems, and how much the world needs the UN at the heart of a functioning rules-based multilateral system. So in closing, I'm looking forward to your questions, but I did want to suggest some ways in which each of you can get involved. First, at a time when many leaders around the world are focused inward, encourage your governments to increase their commitment to strengthening and engaging with the international system, and in particular, the United Nations. Even small countries can have a big impact here, as our experience has borne out. Secondly, get involved with your local UN associations and make your views known as to what you think the UN should focus on over the next 75 years. You can start with a handy survey that the UN is using for this purpose, and my colleague Drew will put the link in the chat to that survey. What should the UN be focusing on? Thirdly, encourage young people to get involved. Now, in many countries, there are model UN programs they can sign up for. With college-age students, of course, there's the possibility of the Geneva Summer School that they can find out about. And every year, there are opportunities for work with the QUNO offices as program assistants, which are opportunities for folks coming out of for recent college graduates, although I should say it's a competitive process and it's only 2 or 3 folks a year in each location who get that appointment. But lastly, and perhaps most importantly, think about peace in your own communities. While big social and political changes can indeed be achieved through protests and organizing, Quaker experience also tells us that lasting and sustainable progress can be made by listening to one another, by bringing people together across divides, by looking for new ways forward based on respect, on dignity, and an appreciation of that of God in everyone. Thank you.